Hello guys. Today we have three extremely interesting panelists to discuss different issues on the international agenda: the United States, the Middle East, the Chinese influence, this night's sabotage on the SNCF in France and its consequences. And I'm happy and delighted to present you our amazing guests and speakers. So we have Mohammed Soliman, who is the director at the Strategic Technologies and Cybersecurity Program at the Middle East Institute. We have James Greene, who is an expert on international affairs with background working for NATO in the past. And we have our friend here, Harold Hyman, who is a Franco-American journalist, a TV journalist, and expert on international affairs. So if I introduced you well, I hope so. So we will roll directly to the questions. And the first question, we all actually witnessed the assassination attempt on Trump, and I'd like actually to discuss this and to start with Jim here. What is the possible impact of this assassination attempt on the electoral campaign in the United States and on general dynamics regarding the very interesting presidential election campaign in the United States? And also we have seen, by the way, that Biden has stepped down and Kamala Harris was nominated as a new candidate from the Democrats for the elections. So, Jim, the floor is yours. You have around 5 minutes, and then we will move to other guests.
Thank you, Denise. It's great to be with you and great to be with such an illustrious group of panelists. It is interesting how quickly now in America the media environment and the media attention shifts. So last week, the assassination attempt on Trump would have been the news. This week, it is already background news. It's history. That's an interesting phenomenon. Not to say that there aren't aspects of it that are important. And I think here, one of the most important things is how it fits in with the narrative within the Republican Party of the past week. And that is that clearly on the Republican side, there has been a bet in Trump's campaign, a bet on a base election. He is working to mobilize the base. Clearly, an assassination attempt on their candidate was very energizing for Trump supporters. It added a sense of excitement and drama to the political convention, the Republican convention in Milwaukee, which certainly raised its profile. And it also fit in with the nomination of J.D. Vance as vice president. And that clearly, Vance brings a double down on the MAGA brand, on the disaffected white rural voter brand. He himself doesn't compliment Trump in any significant way, except perhaps to give some bona fides to Trump's claim to represent the working man in Appalachia, which, for some people it may be strange to see a New York property developer take that mantle, but he seems to have done well with it already without J.D. Vance's help. And it's interesting that in 2022, Vance ran about 6 points behind the generic Republican ballot in Ohio. So even in his own state, he really doesn't bring anything particular. But what he brings is a great deal of coherence to the Trump message. And that coherence is really, I stand for the disaffected, working, white, rural voter. And there are good reasons why those voters have become disaffected over decades. So that's kind of the first element, I think, is this really the coalescing of a base election from the perspective of the Trump campaign. The second was a potential that has not come about, and that is the potential for the failure of the Secret Service to protect Trump and to stop this, and some real serious gaps in their protection and their professional work to play into this deep state versus outsider approach. There was an effort to do that early on. I think the coming together of the leading Democratic contenders, of really everybody, to condemn violence, to support Trump, to reach out and make the phone calls, to hold the Secret Service accountable, and to force the resignation of the Secret Service director. All of that has dissipated that moment, but it's something we'll come back. We will see. So as we look in the future, I think, and then of course, as we look to the future, we'll see that this question of policy in terms of to what extent is Trump going to try to play to the middle or play to a very strong MAGA, base, and that includes isolationism, potential in both foreign affairs and trade, isolationism, protectionism, potential internal crackdowns on illegal immigration, lots of potential turmoil, and Trump has made very clear that he wants to significantly change the face of the civil service. So those are kind of critical issues going forward, not just the campaign, but the policies, and then this sort of expert community, civil service versus the political class, which has been an issue now for really strongly since the Obama administration, but even before that, in the Department of Defense, for example, in the Iraq War. So into that comes the transition in, I would say, the heir apparent from Biden to Harris. I think the Trump assassination helped, and getting COVID helped clarify for Biden his options. He withdrew rather precipitously. My suspicion is that was sped up in order to make a smooth transition to Harris, because that morning, Joe Manchin, the former Democrat, now independent from West Virginia, started to enter the fray. And that's an element, this whole question of sort of the centrist versus progressive within the Democratic Party, the ability to deal with the fault lines on Israel and Palestine, on trade, on this centrist versus progressive more broadly. These are the things that the challenges that face Harris now. And she has consolidated, I think, her position well. We'll see her come out as she's a clear heir apparent. We'll see her be nominated. There will be a question of who the vice president is. It's interesting. All the leading contenders are governors. They kind of fall in two groups. One are more conservative or Southern Democrats, and one are Midwestern, like Governor Pritzker of Illinois or Governor Whitmer of Virginia, as opposed to Beshear of Kentucky or Shapiro, actually, of Pennsylvania, is also an interesting. So that's what's being discussed now, and that question in terms of how it will play in the divide, progressive versus centrist. Will the Democrats go for a base election, try to mobilize their base like the Republicans are doing? Will they play to the middle? Will they try to play to that 20% of Republicans that are clearly disaffected from Trump's foreign policy? And what sorts of changes, I think, in the big picture, America has been a country where our grand strategy or our concept of strategy has differentiated from our interests, you could say our rational interests for time, and our ability to mobilize force or the instruments of power to achieve our national goals isn't an American strong point right now. So how do we do that? What's the role of the state institutions and the expert community moving forward? Those are kind of beyond the election and policy. I think those are the long-term questions, and a President Trump or a President Harris will be dealing with. And of course, I'll also be dealing with the realities of those questions, not just their own desires.
And actually, thank you, by the way, for your very interesting points. And actually, speaking about the foreign policy, I'd like to ask here Harold Hyman the question about what is actually the real place of the foreign policy issues in the electoral campaign. Is it important for the United States citizens or not? What is the place? Because we know in France, for instance, we had just recently snap elections, legislative elections, and the foreign policy agenda wasn't dominant. There were some attempts to use for the for its benefits the crisis in the not the crisis, but the war between Israel and Hamas. But generally speaking, the questions were, about the rising prices, taxes, immigration, etc. So, Harold, what is the place of the foreign policy in the U.S. elections?
All right, I speak as someone, thank you, who doesn't live in the States, but who goes there regularly, watches and reads every single day, while being in France. So one would compare the two, France and the U.S. 1992 referendum on Maastricht, the yes to Maastricht wins by a tiny amount. This is Bosnia, the Bosnian effect. Hundreds of thousands of people, including myself, said we cannot give a signal to Bosnia that Europe doesn't matter. So once in a while, it really does matter in an election, foreign policy. It's a question of timing, it's a question of mood. In the U.S., I think that the Israel question has obviously become central. Ukraine is kind of muddled, but the question of Israel-Gaza, the deaths in Gaza are becoming a very heavy burden for the Democrats. They can no longer ignore it. In France, since we don't really support Israel the way the U.S. does with massive armaments, there wasn't such a big problem during the European elections concerning Gaza. The far left accused Macron of being, a supporter of Israel, but it was very muted. And he himself said several times, Netanyahu, you must forbear. Netanyahu, you must go for peace right away. And we have several French hostages. And, since France has the largest Jewish minority in all of Western Europe by far, this is a very important question. And obviously with the backdrop of the largest Muslim minority in Western Europe, maybe in competition with the Netherlands or something. But that question was avoided altogether. So in the U.S., I see it very strongly, and I hear the simplified rhetoric of Trump and Vance saying that, we want our money's worth of help. NATO has to defend itself, or we're not going to be there for them. And had we been strong and muscular and Trumpian, Putin would have never dared. And he only attacked because Biden pulled out 200 American troops. Okay, so they're using it really strongly, and it's I think central in the American election the way it is not central in the French election. And most of our international involvements meet with unanimous support or support and indifference and a tiny, tiny amount of opposition. So no one is being punished for the African or the Afghan adventures or whatever, the operations. I don't mean to say they were crazy adventures. So I think it's much stronger in the U.S. than it is in France. My conclusion.
Thank you, Harold. And speaking of the foreign policy, actually, and I'd like to jump to the Middle Eastern area. And we've been observing, and the question will go to Mr. Soliman here. And we've been observing since decades, the declining of the United States presence in the Middle East. We've seen Russia arriving in Syria. It was 2013, if I'm not mistaken, 13. And we currently seen China as a more and more important player. Just recently, there was Ukraine's foreign minister who went to China to discuss with his counterpart his plan, And we've seen that the Chinese are also trying to broker some kind of a peace deal between the Palestine and Israel. We continue to observe the attacks by the Yemeni Houthis on the ships going through the Red Sea. So the region is quite unstable, but we are seeing more presence of China or more women coming from Beijing to be active in this region. So how do you see this, Mohammed?
I mean, Dave, thank you for inviting me, and it's a great honor to be with Jem and Harold on this panel. Also, you're giving me a disservice because I'm not sure if I can sound smart after what these two gentlemen have said, but I'm going to take a crack at it. I will try. Let me give you a bigger picture about how I see the U.S. foreign policy. Clearly, there are major changes when it comes to the way American foreign policymakers are thinking about America's global position, generally speaking. So all the arguments about trade-offs between Taiwan, Ukraine, the situation in Gaza with Israel, all reflection of the idea that America understands that there is a rise of the rest. America does not really have the resources to manage multiple theaters at the same time, right? When President Trump came to power and then his team in the Pentagon changed from a 2-theater military to 1-theater military, and then we had President Biden coming to power in 2020, his team did not change that back, right? Meaning that there's a bipartisan consensus that American military cannot maintain 2-theater posture at the same time. So the main conclusion of that, how can you manage this new situation? You try to pressure Europeans to increase their defense spending. We had four different presidents from the two parties, President Bush, President Obama, President Trump, President Biden. 4 different presidents, 4 different characters, different tone, different style, have been asking and urging Europeans to step up when it comes to defenses. Of course, the Ukraine war added a different layer of complexity here because of the threat perception, the way that the Russian threat is altering the broader geopolitics of Europe. And there is a sense among Washington policymakers that Europe is not doing enough. And this is the main argument that we have, that Europe has to step up. Yes, America will do the major burden, will do the main intervention, will support the Europeans, will make sure that NATO is strong, but that's not sustainable because the fear in Washington is what we're going to do about Taiwan, right? The assets that we need in Taiwan. And we did have backlog when it comes to certain equipments, missiles, air defense systems that were supposed to be sent to Taiwan, but were sent to Ukraine. So this is adding a lot of uncertainties about the way forward. This is why you're hearing all these different arguments. Then let me pivot to the question of China. China, and according to Dr. Jaishankar, Indian foreign minister, China has been, while America has been fighting but not winning in the last 20 years, China is winning but not fighting in the Middle East. China is a selective power, meaning they're not really aimed to, they understand that America is very entrenched in the Middle East specifically, very well rooted since the 70s as a successor to British Empire. This is in the perception of the Chinese. Therefore, what the Chinese aim to do is to alter the hierarchy of power in the Middle East by telling allies and partners in the region that you can work with the Americans and you can also work with us. Meanwhile, we in Washington tell everyone you can only work with us. So clearly, what the Chinese are offering much more flexible. 2, the Chinese are meeting countries where they are, not where they wish they are. Meaning they understand that all these countries have their own ambitions, their own interest, and they're able to meet them, they're able to provide for them. Either infrastructure, finances, military, tech, sharing IP, even sharing some sensitive information. So the Chinese are opening up with many countries in the region. They are able to work with Iran and Saudi. They're able to talk to the Israelis. They're working with the Iraqis and the Egyptians. Clearly, this is something that America doesn't have right now. On top of that, I would say, the Chinese believe that Washington did a lot of strategic missteps in the Middle East that embodies how this American-led order is not fair and is not really the right governance structure for this multipolar environment for everyone. Not only the global South, but global South, middle powers, regional powers. So right now, there are more countries that have similar perception about how the global order should be. This list could include Iran, but also include Indonesia. Could include even Nigeria and South Africa, Saudi and Egypt and UAE, partners and allies to the United States, and also foes and enemies of the United States. And this is appealing to many countries. To take this another layer down, let's talk about the question of Gaza. China understands very well the pain points when it comes to American foreign policy. The idea of America as an extension of colonization, or America as a hegemon that doesn't really have any sort of respect for certain cultures or identities or small countries. And you will see this through the way Chinese managed the communication and foreign policy, and the way they handled their seat on the UN Security Council when it comes to Gaza, because they wanted to show that they are the leader of the global South, leader of this new multipolar environment, and they have been playing their card very well, to be very frank here. Will this be successful or not? I think we're in a moment of chaos. I'm not really sure. I think I don't really have any sort of certainty about how this will go. We're not really in a moment of peace, but also we're not really in a moment of war yet. There are a lot of things that are very uncertain, but clearly having Ukraine, having Gaza, and tensions around Taiwan are all indicative that we are in a moment of great uncertainty, and the Chinese are very well positioned to exploit these sort of uncertainties for their own foreign policy positions. I'll stop here.
Just a quick follow-up question, really short. We've seen the Chinese active with regard to Ukraine, whether they will be successful or not. It's another question. We've seen that the Chinese brokered the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement, as we say, and right now the Chinese are trying to broker this Palestine-Israel deal. So we are actually seeing that the Chinese are trying to position themselves as some kind of a peace broker on the world stage. Am I correct or not? Because prior to this, there were different countries. We remember that Switzerland, for example, was always considered as some kind of a neutral ground. In China, it's not a neutral ground. But how come they're managing to take a role of this middleman with regard to the peace broker?
We talked about this before. They say demography is destiny. I would say economy is destiny. When you have the rise of Asian powers, that means that will ultimately alter hierarchy of power structure globally. That means it's no longer Paris, it's no longer London. It is now it's Beijing, it's Jakarta, where they have more sway and they have a stick at it. Two, let's talk about Iran, Saudi. China is the biggest energy consumer and importer of Middle Eastern energy, and that makes them very well positioned to able to bring Tehran and Riyadh together, a position that Washington cannot do that. That's very difficult for Washington to broker. They are seen as a capable country that and they're trying to position themselves as the good guys in the room. They don't really have the same package of European hegemony or European colonization for the last 500 years. And America is seen as part of that sort of tradition in the mindset of many people in the South, in the global South. So they're able to exploit that. They have the economics and the finance, the leverage to able to bring countries together. And that leverage is not only finances. Finance is they are the global factory, demographics, their positions in Asia. Things have changed. So it's no longer going to be Geneva. It's going to be Beijing. It's going to be, I think I told you this before, I think I have more global audience, like I see more global audience and list of attendees in Delhi than what I see in London or in Rome or Brussels. I have to go to Delhi and Jakarta just for me to see what actually is happening on the global stage than what we're hearing in Washington, or in Europe. And you know what? This is a new norm, and we have to get adjusted to that.
Very interesting point indeed. And right now, actually, I'm quite puzzled to whom address my next question. So I think I'm actually addressing to both Harold and Jim. So we are seeing China being more active, not only in the Middle East, but on the world stage. We're seeing Russia as some kind of a rogue state that is trying to annex parts of Ukraine right now and interfere into the African affairs, for instance, and they quite a big role against France. What the West can do to address those issues, or to the West, I mean, the West is generally speaking like the United States and France and NATO. Actually, we can talk about NATO because we know that there is also cooperation between NATO and the certain of the Arab states, for instance, the Gulf states. So, Jim, maybe I'll start with you. How do you see the loss of pertinence of the United States on different stages, on different parts of the world stage? How do you explain this, and what your country can actually do to acquire or to get back the level of I don't know, maybe the level of respect, if you can say this, or the level of trust?
That's an interesting question, Denise. I think one of the clear issues for the states, and as Mohammed was speaking, I was thinking about the sort of the self-identity of Americans. We don't tend to think of ourselves as global hegemons. That's not part of the political identity. We're uncomfortable with the idea of being colonial powers, of being hegemon on an individual basis.
But that's the perception others have regarding the United States.
It is, and this is a challenge. So when you look at, there are, of course, in American history, plenty of thinkers who have talked about the need to have global presence and global influence going back into the 19th century. And Mahan, for example, the influence of sea power on history. But the challenge that I think America is facing today is really this question of understanding that the rest of the world matters. So there's one part of America that believes that if we just go behind the big moats of the Atlantic and the Pacific, that we can live a quiet, peaceful existence like me and my mountain family home up here, and that nothing else matters. And we forget that history intrudes. The part of the American Appalachia where I live is incredibly remote historically, but that didn't keep a British commander from sending messages in 1780 saying, declare allegiance to King George III, or I will come with fire and sword. And it didn't keep an army of 1,000 men from crossing the mountains behind the messengers and winning the Battle of King's Mountain as this army appears. So, America has this very strange relationship with the rest of it, and we're trying to deal with it now in an environment where discussion about the world is not particularly healthy in our society. Harold mentioned the Palestine Israel discussion, and this is morphed in public perception, what we see every day through the lens of the media, which of course intentionally for business reasons magnifies the loudest voices of the extremes. So what we see is not just Palestine, Israel, we see overtly pro-Hamas demonstrations, people celebrating attacks and turning this effective, it's not just Israel-Palestine, it's a reflection of internal politics. When people talk about Netanyahu, they're not talking about his role, at least a general American, it's not talking about his role in Israel. They're talking about him as an avatar for their political supporters or opponents' preferences in America. And the same thing with people looking at Hamas. They're looking at Hamas as a, not for what it does in the Middle East, but as a symbol of a fight against oppression. And so you have these interesting phenomena on American campuses of LGBTQ organizations supporting Hamas, for which there appears to be no logical inconsistency in the minds of the people doing it. So it really is this internalization. America's very insular, and our political class has been very much ascendant, really since Bush's time. Rumsfeld is famous for having ignored military advice going into planning for the second Iraq. Obama talked about the blob and was incensed that he felt the military forced him to make a surge in Afghanistan. Trump has attacked the deep state as one of his principal questions. Biden really forced the system to withdraw from Afghanistan on his time schedule because he felt that his views, which were to have a much lighter lighter footprint during the Obama administration had been ignored. And to some extent, what we have right now in America is a chastened Biden from the disaster in Afghanistan, having acquiesced to the foreign policy community in areas like Ukraine, but not completely. So yes, we'll send weapons, but our real strategy is going to be not to upset the Russians so much that we have escalation. So we're going to replicate the successes of Korea and Vietnam in terms of the way we think about strategy, right? So there is a lot of confusion within the American political spectrum. On the right, we have an interesting and Harold, you mentioned Israel, Hamas as the big issue. On the right, it's Ukraine, and although the Ukraine skeptics get most of the public attention on the right, partially because people on the left would like to highlight that. The reason they want to highlight it is the fault line within the Republican. I live in an area that has been sent a number of very strong MAGA candidates to Congress. We currently are represented by a rather traditional conservative. He had a challenger who focused on anti-Ukraine, Russia's okay, NATO are freeloaders, and he was crushed 2-1. So this is the undercurrent within sort of the center right in America. You have 20% of the electorate the Republican electorate continued to vote against Trump even after Haley withdrew. And those aren't people for whom Haley appearing at the convention, which she did to support Trump, is going to be dispositive. Those are people who are looking for policy. So it's an interesting question, sort of within the political system. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with the current lack of, call it populist thinking on right and left, which fails to meet critical interests. And in that space, you see some of the expert class and the practitioners reasserting themselves. Most recently, General Kurila has become more and more vocal. He's the commander of CENTCOM, in the need to take more decisive action against the Houthis, because just the idea that we're going to sort of attrite their stockpiles is insufficient to be able to really stop their capability to attack. So these are the kinds of discussions that are coming on. And I would say in the big picture, until America can get its own thoughts together about what we want to be, about how we're going to, what our role in the world is, about how we can play a constructive role, we're going to have a hard time maintaining influence. There was a time when, one of the critical roles that America has had in NATO and in Europe has been the outsider that doesn't have a border, right? And that's a role that we've played in many, many places in the past. And it appears that I think Mohammed is right, that China is trying to take that role of the disinterested outsider. And of course, China has its own interests, and those will play with time, particularly in areas where people have loans to them. So, have a financials.
But let's stop here because I have a question I almost forgot about, and then we will get back to the security issues in the Middle East. It actually, this night, we had and this question will go directly to Harold here. We've had the sabotage at the SNCF. SNCF is the French railways. And right now there are different theories who may be responsible for this. And today we have the opening of the ceremony of the opening of the Olympic Games here in Paris. And the question is, we observe the proliferation of different, let's say, hybrid actions, hybrid threats, hybrid attacks that often use proxy forces, that often use terrorist forces, and countries behind. I'm not speaking about today's event because we don't know yet what exactly happened, but I'd like to talk in general terms, because the going back to our local snap elections that we had in end of May and beginning of end of June and beginning of July, we had also a lot of questions about immigration. So the question is quite complex, I would say. So first, Harold, if you could tell us, maybe you have some more information about this sabotage at the SNCF, who was behind, because I hear theories that Iran may be behind it, or I've seen that some said that those were the ultra left or far left activists who were behind it, and I don't see to be honest, the reason why would they do it. And second part of this question, this is a clarification. The question actually is, we're observing in France the lines of division and the focus on the migration issue. We've seen that we observe the Israelis against Muslims, Muslims against Israelis. We actually observe the somehow internalization of different conflicts in the world. And for example, when we have a conflict between the Palestine and Israel, we see this translation of this conflict, for example, in France, and then, by the way, other Western societies where there are different important migrant groups. So the question is, Harold, what is really happening with the sabotage at the SNCF? And another issue is the migration issue. What is the instrumentalization of this issue by foreign states in France? If you may say something, and then we will go to the issue of the Middle East.
I'll start with the last question. What instrumentalization is coming from foreign states?
Yes, concerning the migrants, the different groups within a society.
There's not direct involvement. I mean, Russia has always ridiculed French immigration policy as being self-destruction by France through the import of masses of Muslims, among whom there is a Salafi extreme element that is terrifying our cities, and we should have been friends with Russia to avoid this. So that's a clear one. Other countries in Western Europe are doing essentially the same thing as France. We cannot, our rules and regulations and ethical European norms do not allow us to simply push all migrants back into the sea. That we will not do that, even though it happens marginally. Basically, we rescue everybody. And so the question becomes very paralyzing, because you can see them every single day in Paris. I'm a bike rider in the city. I can tell you where they're sleeping. I mean, they're little mini villages throughout the city. So it's really not complicated at all. And they've, of course, become auxiliary delivery boys to an extreme scale. So everyone's ordering out because of this. So there is no real criticism. I mean, Britain got all crazy about immigration and ended up in Brexit, but they've never had more, because, they would have to triple their navy to block the channel from the small boats. So no one really knows what to do. And no country has decided to, push them back in the sea. The landlocked countries can do it. Hungary can do it, but Italy cannot. Greece cannot. They cannot sink ships at sea. They can push them to the next country, but sooner or later, somebody's going to pick up the migrants, and they do. The responsibility of the sending countries is completely absent. It struck me as funny when Niger overthrew their regular president, who today they said could now incur the death penalty for prevarication, dereliction of duty, I don't know, all these trumped up charges. But even as they had done that, they were still letting their own citizens leave and go to France. So it doesn't make much sense. I don't think we're dealing with states that have the same conception of what a state is. You see the three juntas in the Sahel. I can't understand how they think. So I'll leave it at that. But your second question was who's Who did the sabotage?
No, actually, the question wasn't about who, because we don't know yet, but the sabotage happened today, and there are different theories. Maybe you could fill us in about those theories and maybe your thoughts about it.
Oh, there's the ultra left mixed in with the radical green sector, which is quite distinct from the normal elected green sector. It's not. We mustn't mix them up. That one is like almost black blocs, and the other ones are like socialists dipped in green sauce. And then you have the Russian, and then you have the Iranian track. And the Iranian track is a new thing because the Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz just did a tweet about 2 hours ago saying it's an Iranian plot. And it's been some time now since I've been hearing this in several circles like this one, but people who only do Iran, and they say they're preparing something. So it would be a new thing to have this sort of Iranian Shiite. I shouldn't even say Iranian Shiite. Let's call it the Mullah regime's Shiite action to really, really disrupt French internal politics. And then, of course, there's the Russian, and the Russian is already perfectly is spread out throughout the country, and they have all the relays they need, and blowing up an electric relay station on the high-speed train is very easy for the SVR type people, and who knows if there's a confluence from the three. I mean, one of my trusted sources says it's the Russian, and the Israelis are on the Iranian. So, and in the early stages, the French government seemed to be indicating it might be the Greens, the ultra Greens. So I'll leave it at that.
I see. And speaking about this, as you've said, the hybrid forces and the possible terrorists, I would like to go to the Middle East because last week, if I'm not mistaken, there was another attack on the ship in the Red Sea coming from the Houthis, the Yemeni Houthis. And this crisis is almost went under the radars. We don't hear talking people about it. It's not part of the K agenda right now in the media. And we still didn't manage to put this crisis to an end. We observed the...
Can I jump in? You say it's not a media agenda, but in reality, the media agenda is very much the government's agenda. Or as Tim said, sometimes, we exaggerate, we simplify and exaggerate the extremes because, it's sexy TV. We follow the government, really, more than anything. If they consider the enemy to be, let's say, one day it's Hezbollah, then we're all looking at Hezbollah. We don't actually say, oh, well, today we don't like what the government said about Hezbollah. We're going to say it's, somebody else, Jaish, something or other.
Exactly.
So we don't, just to say, we don't have an autonomous agenda.
Yeah, I understand. So the question to Mohammed is, where are we right now with this, as we call it, Red Sea crisis? We've seen that the United States and the British attempts to bomb Houthis out didn't pay out. It didn't bring any tangible results. We've seen the Chinese, yet again, trying to broker and trying to discuss, and I believe we've talked about it briefly with you maybe a few months ago, that the Chinese try to find some kind of an understanding with the Iranians, because we hear that the Iranians may be responsible and they send weapons to the Houthis. So where are we right now with this Red Sea crisis, and what can be done possibly from the Chinese perspective, from the local perspective, from the US perspective, because we've seen that the bombings didn't help to solve this crisis. What can be done to actually bring it down on the scale or to solve it completely?
It's a moment of chaos. When you interviewed me a few months ago, I told you America doesn't do well fighting an unstate actor. You may be able to degrade their capabilities. You may be able to destroy some of their positions, but they're an unstate actor. They're in the mountains. Kissinger used to say that the theory of victory is different between a state and non-state actor. The very fact that they're there in Sana'a is an indication of their success, quite frankly. They are able to impose their agenda on the rest of the world when it comes to Red Sea. They are able to, they're also able to use U.S. airstrikes, the British/American airstrikes, to their favor domestically by saying, well, look at us. We are defenders of Arab Pride against American intervention, and that empowered them more against other local factions within Yemen. Don't know what's saying in there, because clearly when you look into the multiple state actors, especially Houthi and Hezbollah, they made it very clear that their agenda is tied to Gaza. So am I able to envision a scenario where both are decoupled? Hard to imagine that. That's number one. Number two, there's also confluence of factors that started to play a hand. The way Russia, China are interacting with these non-state actors clearly started to change. We're seeing the beginning of that. I'm not saying they are attacking them. I'm just saying that there is something that has changed. And part of it is the conflict has been ongoing on for a long time, right? We're about to hit a year in a month or two. So that's another point that I'm looking into. What America should do, or what America can do, I don't know.
Depends. United States, China, other actors. What can be done? Because we've seen it, as you said, almost a year the crisis is ongoing, and there is no solution on the table.
America doesn't know what are its priorities anymore. There's a larger point that I can make that, in addition to what the two gentlemen have said, but America is going through identity change because of demographics and class. And that clearly started to play a role on the left and right when it comes to foreign conflict, right? Of course, the grievances on the right when it comes to Ukraine and Russia is different. The same thing on the left, but they also have a similar, a common theme. The more diverse America becomes, the less consensus you will have about foreign issues. It's not about coming home America. It's mostly about the lack of consensus. Two, the question of foreign financing and foreign funding will be difficult to manage when you have families in certain states that are struggling to make ends meet, right? $170 billion for Ukraine, while families are not able to make ends meet at the end of the month. That's going to be difficult to justify. So those two things are playing a role, not only in the question of the Middle East, but Middle East, Ukraine, Taiwan. And this is why I'm saying America doesn't have clarity about the Middle East, right? And when I say clarity, you can argue that there's some sort of clarity / consensus about the question of China/Taiwan, because there's a very clear case that's being made and there is a receptive audience to it, right? People in America are able to understand Chinese threat when it comes to their buckets, when it comes to their wages, when it comes to products and dumping and all these issues. You also have a big faction in America that are able to understand Russia in the context of Cold War, Soviet Union. Middle East right now started to be a bit gray between those two theaters. And this is why America is much more on firefighting mode rather than proactive, right? Because no one is able to articulate a case for what America is doing. I can articulate a case for what America should do. I think America should be building an architecture for the region and focus more on empowering regional partners to take more leading role, because they have more stakes into this. They're able to talk to each other. America, in some cases, might not be the right interlocutor. And we have seen this when it comes to Houthi. We have seen this when it comes to Iran-Saudi deal that was brokered by the Chinese. We're seeing this when it comes to Syria, the dynamics there. So clearly, we are not able to impose our agenda. So for us to be part of that sort of new discourse, you build an order. You do what we did in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, Quad and the Philippines, Japan, Australia, US, the trilateral between Korea and Japan, those sort of frameworks that we built in the Indo-Pacific, I think we need to use the same strategy in the Middle East and try to deconflict the issues. Because right now I feel like there are a lot of issues that are lumped up together. I'm not really sure what's the US interest in. Of course, it's critique right now, but I'm venting at this point.
And actually, just recently, I read that China becomes one of the key Saudi Arabia's provider in terms of arms. And it seems, because we know that prior to this, the Saudis were mostly relying on the United States armaments, and right now we are seeing it shifting. So do we assist to this shifting of the influences, and the key countries, for example, like Saudi Arabia in the region, after actually the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian war, started to somehow diversify its alliances and seeing in China a partner or I don't know, or maybe another ally to advance this agenda. So first of all, I'd like you maybe to confirm if it's really happening. Speaking of the Chinese becoming the Saudis' top arms provider right now, because the Saudis are looking for the armaments, and China is a handy producer and handy provider for this, especially they're not talking about the human rights issues when they're selling arms. And do we really see this trend not only generally in the global south, but speaking about the Middle East in a narrow sense? The key countries are really trying to get most of every big actor within this global competition of big states.
That's a tough question. I'm speaking right now as an engineer, not a policy guy. Deindustrialization of the West was the biggest self-destruction thing that has ever happened. Chinese biggest strength and the most important strength in this century is production at scale. Production at scale at very reasonable / cheap cost. And you cannot compete with that. You just can't. Ukraine and Taiwan proven that point. When you look into the way Russia turned itself into a war economy, in the way they are changed their industrial base to cater to their military needs in Ukraine, and the way the Chinese are able to fill that gap on the commercial side, and their capability to produce tech legacy ships to AI ships. Clearly, they have a major advantage, and we are just playing catch up at this point. And let's be frank here, it's America on its own, because we do not have the European industrial base, right? I know that our European friends don't like to hear that, but the European deindustrialization is extremely destructive. America has the capacity, demographics, finance, and innovation ecosystem to rebuild the industrial base, but that will take time. And without Europe, I am not sure if we'll be where we used to be in 1950s, 1960s. So let me then answer your question directly. The Chinese are offering what the Americans are not offering. Quantity, quality, cost, and time. We are not able to do that. We are right now in a moment where we are basically changing the receiving nations when it comes to certain equipments, because we're not able to cater to more than 2 or 3 nations at the same time, right? So if there's if the Ukrainians are on the defense, let's send them stuff that we're supposed to go to Taiwan. If Israel is under a certain attack, let's ship certain things that were supposed to be to Ukraine, but we send it to Israel, right? So we're basically playing trade-off, because we cannot support our needs, our allies' needs at the same time. And by the way, the rest of the world understand that. Policymakers in Indonesia and in India and in Kenya and everywhere in Asia understand that the American industrial base cannot fill that sort of needs. Meanwhile, you have China filling that gap. It started with tech. That was very clear with the 5G question 8 years ago. And guess what? The only way for America to able to defend against Chinese 5G was basically to force allies, not forget partners, to force allies to divest from Huawei when it comes to 5G network, right? The very idea that Americans fought with or bickered with Germans and the Brits and the French over Huawei was very indication of where we are. And the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Egyptians and the Turks understand that very well, and they're either building their own indigenous industrial base They are cooperating with the Chinese and Koreans and other Asian powers. That's going to be the new norm. And you cannot make the case to any sovereign nation that you should not acquire or buy Chinese equipment if you're not able to offer the alternative.
And I know it's. Please go ahead.
And to add, I'm gonna stop. But one quick point as well to say. So it's not only the Americans is not able to provide it. Also, there are a lot of restrictions on our military sale. It's always backlogged. We have a major problem when it comes to timelines. Meanwhile, that doesn't really exist anywhere, right? That, of course, is overshadowing. I mean, there is a reason why the Egyptians pivoted to the French when it comes to Air Force because of time and what they need. Also, the same thing when it comes to Navy. They also became much more dependent on the Italians and the French because of the same thing. When you think about the size and the Emiratis, they're pivoting towards Vietnam and Korea because they feel that they're able, and Chinese, of course, to get more IP and more localization. And I feel like this is something we are missing the boat on.
And extremely important and interesting point. And we've seen it also. I mean, the point about the fact that the Chinese are actually able to provide. There is a cost. There is the time frame. And we've seen, for example, that Poles also, they placed a lot of orders on armaments, not in Europe, where they're part of, not in the United States as well, but not in such quantities, but in Korea, in South Korea. They've ordered hundreds and hundreds of tanks, howitzers, even aircraft. And that's really something that the Western markets, the Western producers were not ready to produce in such quantities, and it's really something we should be thinking about. So, going back to the Middle East, Harold, France used to be one of the key actors in that region, and even regarding the current Red Sea crisis, we've sent 2 frigates to try to patrol and to protect the maritime navigation. But I mean, we were also, and we still remain, a provider of producer and provider of armaments for those countries. But do we have any influence left in that place, in this part of the world? What is your take on it?
Talking about Africa?
No, I'm speaking of the Middle East. But Africa is another issue because we've been pushed away by the Russians from many of
momentarily. Yes. That's my little word. Very momentarily. Because it's going worse in the Sahel. Everything is going downhill and fast. But in the Middle East, concerning France, we managed never to be completely eliminated from the scene without ever managing to be a major player. So we're a sort of continuous, medium-sized player, and essentially we can talk to the Lebanese parties, including Hezbollah. We can talk to the Palestinian Authority. We can talk to all the Gulf states. We can sort of talk to Turkey, even though that doesn't necessarily give us much payback. And we can talk to Iraq. And we can even slightly talk to Iran. So as long as we're like doing what the United States is not doing in all categories, Lebanon and Iran, they certainly aren't. We're like useful. So I'll leave it at that.
And I'll have a question to Jim and then one question to all of you to wrap up our discussion. So Jim, you've worked for NATO for quite some time and you've been stationed in Europe, including in Ukraine as well. And right now there is this, let's say, perception that the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia may be like real negotiations, may be really kicking off somewhere next year. And with possibilities of Ukrainians trading off the territory. I mean, there are a lot of different possible scenarios right now. But by the way, I remember in 2008, I was in NATO HQ as a student on a NATO HQ in Brussels at a visit. And I remember all those discussions about the inventing or reinventing the purpose for NATO, or it was 2007 even. But what's NATO role? Because we know that there is Istanbul, if I'm not mistaken, Istanbul initiative. What is the role of NATO in helping the countries in the Middle East to acquire more stability? Because we know that NATO's role, for example, in Eastern Europe was quite crucial to help those countries to create proper armed forces and to introduce the democratic control, by the way, over those parliamentary control over those forces. So what's NATO role in, because we don't talk about it a lot, by the way, as well, what is NATO role in the Middle East? Not we are talking about the United States or separate countries, but NATO as a whole.
It's a good question, and I think you point towards the answer. As in fact, when Mohammed was talking about his critique or wishes for American policy, NATO really is the expression of that. It's a framework in which it's almost let's say perfect, but it's an excellent framework in which you can bring together regional players that have their own difficult histories and relationships to have achieve certain things in ways that both allow large countries, including the U.S., the largest, to provide leadership, and smaller countries to protect their interests, because everyone has a veto over the various actions. Within NATO, of course, you have common interests and you have common certain level of democracy that's expected, economic freedom, those sorts of things, which create less variety of interests than, say, in the United Nations. So you're able to find through this day-to-day operation over many, many years to set forward common paths and common interests. There's an expression of that both at the political level and at the technical level. And after the fall of the communist countries, the first thing NATO did was invited all these former Warsaw Pact countries to meet at the political level back in 1991 in the North Atlantic Coordination Council. And that then turned to Partnership for Peace, which was really about putting this down to the technical level. And I think that ability to both focus the attention of leadership on a positive outcome and to be able to engage with the technical level to create a common culture is the critical sort of two-level aspect to that. If you look at the critical role of the armed forces in Ukraine in the success of the Orange Revolution, for example, or the Revolution of Dignity, in both cases, they absolutely refused to get involved. And when other state institutions tried to get involved in attacking or repressing protests, they actively countered them, or at least threatened to counter them. And a lot of this had to do with a new sense of what their identity was. We, as like one of the critical commanders of unit 72nd Mechanized in 2004, a unit that worked with NATO, had just been assigned to NATO and very much embraced it. Their commander said, we work with NATO now. It's our future. He refused orders to surround Kiev in 2004. It was then Lieutenant Colonel Syrski, now the commander.
The same Syrski.
Same Syrski. So, that sense, and by that time already, over 20,000 Ukrainians had participated in NATO operations, peacekeeping operations, exercises. That sense of socialization to common norms, I think, was very important, not just in Ukraine, but throughout Europe. And in fact, during the Cold War, throughout the alliance, in getting countries that had difficult histories to cooperate for common goals. So I think if I look at the potential value of NATO in the sort of three big blocks, you have the countries in the Western Sahara that are part of the Mediterranean dialogue, and the countries in the Eastern Med, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, and then the countries in the Gulf that are part of the Istanbul Initiative. And in each case, creating an environment where you have constant discussion constant exchange at both a, call it, political but not visible level, and a senior strategic level, and then an implementer level, that begins to build and shape the kinds of understandings and forces that exist, and can be very, very stabilizing. It also happens below the radar, and I think is highly unappreciated by senior political leaders who tend to focus on the top line figures like percentage of GDP or other politically salient things that are being reported in the press. The political class in our countries is far more attuned to the press than it is practitioners today, and that's not a strength. It's one of the reasons I think that practitioners need to have a strong relationship with the press, and not just leaking, but actually helping the press to understand the issues and why things matter. It's unfortunate from a practitioner's point of view that sometimes it's more effective to help educate a journalist to convince your boss than it is to actually pitch the idea to your boss directly, or the political class directly. But that's, I think, the truth, and something that we should think about more in Western countries, and something we should help in emerging countries too. There are some Eastern European countries that have worked very hard to try to prevent that sort of divergence within their civil society and experts.
And before I thank you all for this beautiful discussion, I'd like to ask the three of you the same question. And we all see the security climate deteriorating more or less everywhere in the world. Russo-Ukrainian war, the conflicts in the Middle, crises and conflicts in the Middle East, conflicts and crises in Africa, Taiwan issue, resurgent Russia, resurgent China. So and we've seen, by the way, the use of the proxies and the terrorism and energy. By the way, we remember Russia with its Nord Stream pipeline. So it seems that this China, Russia, Iran, North Korea axis is somehow winning or trying to win against the Western countries. And in your opinion, why this is happening, and what are the key techniques and leverages those countries use in order to advance their agenda? So you have really, you can talk whatever example you want, and let's start with Mohammed, please.
You said the Russia-China axis, or what kind of axis?
I said China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. What I meant here, it's not there is this kind of an axis, but I meant that the non-democratic, non-Western countries seems to be somehow winning against the West.
I don't want to be contrarian here. I mean, I literally wrote a piece for Newsweek saying that there's a danger of lumping together Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia together. I think...
please elaborate on it, please.
I think the moment we start treating them as one coherent group, they're going to act as one coherent group. I think it's a mistake. I think there are structural problems that the four of them have with each other. Russia, China is a much more complex relationship than just describing Russia as a vassal state. Of course, they do not really have the same strong hand they used to have in their relationship with Beijing. I agree with that. But reducing Russia to a vassal state is tough. I think there's also underappreciation for the way India is within that sort of dynamic, as a bridge, as a part of triangle between China and Russia, the same way when it comes to Iran and the Gulf. So I think it's much more complicated than one greater axis of evil connotation here. And the reason why I am hesitant to embrace that, you want to fight a global alliance? I mean, I am not really sure if we do have the resources or allies or partners to do that. This is no longer 1930s, 1940s. Two, I'm very hesitant to embrace the democracy versus authoritarianism lens, to be frank with you. I think we need to be very, very honest about where we are and also about different cultures and different civilizations. If we agree that this is going to be much more multipolar based on demography, geography, economy and military power, we also need to be very comfortable dealing with countries that do not have the same values and do not have the same vision when it comes to running their own societies. You don't have the upper hand to enforce your values, right? And whenever I'm in Asia, and I travel to Asia quite frankly a lot, there is a lot of criticism towards the way liberalism and global liberalism has functioned domestically in the West. Like, no one really is looking into France or United States today and say, wow, we need to be like them. I don't think that we're an attractive model to others. And we need to be humble about that. We need to be humble about who we are, about our problems, our challenges, and about the fact that people right now are looking to Dubai and Singapore as models, not towards New York and London as models. Again, I know that I became a bit contrarian about your question, but are we losing? I don't know. I mean, what's losing and what's victory here? I think
that's a good question. That's a good question as well.
I think America is extremely powerful. I think America has a very structural strength. I think it's not really the decline of the West. I think it's the decline of Europe. I think America is very powerful, have an upper hand. I think America will play a major role in defining some of the major trends around Eurasia in the 21st century. We may not be the indispensable nation, as Secretary Albright said, but we're going to be an extremely important nation, one of the top 2, top 3 powers in this century. So I'm very optimistic about where America is. I think America has the factors that allow the country to improve and self-sustain, very secure in our location. Our future is the Western Hemisphere, economically, demographically. This is where we are. I'm not sure where Europe is going to go from here. I think this is a different conversation. But broadly speaking, I think we're going to enter a gray area where the definition of losing and winning is going to be very hard to define.
This already is the case. Harold, please, your thoughts.
I forgot the question.
The questioning, I started with the issue about the non-democratic countries that are not part of the West, for example, like China, Russia, advancing.
Yes, I got it. I got it.
And then we had this amazing comment from Mohammed about the definition of losing, winning, who's winning, and that the mistake of taking those countries is some kind of an exit.
Yes.
So yes, please, your thoughts on it.
I don't see Russia and China being on the same page ever at all. I think what we are seeing is a very high level Chinese opportunism and a sort of almost obsequious attitude of Putin towards China in order to win his ridiculous war in Ukraine. He will suffer, Russia will suffer terribly from this one day. North Korea is simply a little rogue annoyance which may become intolerable through its nuclear gesticulations and force Japan to suddenly reassert itself. Maybe the Taiwanese question will also force Japan to reassert itself. The Western Europeans in all this will look very marginal, very, very marginal. So if we don't at least figure out Ukraine as Western Europeans, we can't play any other game outside of little sideshows. So I think either we see the union of Russia, China, North Korea as something so gigantic we can't touch it, or we realize that it's not made to last, that we have to get Ukraine and Russia out of the way and then worry about China. That is a lot of strategic thinking, which the population, the mood will not swallow at all. So we're really stuck, and we are waiting for God to arrive in a chariot to pull us out of this.
Thank you. And Jim, your thoughts?
I agree that we shouldn't look at Russia, China, North Korea, Iran as an alliance, but we should certainly look at them as having confluence of interests. and mutually supporting each other. Certainly, the Russians and the Chinese have no love, in fact, for each other, and in fact, a high level of racism towards each other. That has not prevented cooperation in the past, and currently, I think we're seeing a high level of cooperation for China trying, within the framework of its broader interests, its broader economy, to keep Russia fighting. It does not have an interest in change in Russia or in the loss of the Putin regime. Similarly, both countries have an interest in North Korea being a thorn in the U.S. side and in our East Asian ally side, particularly when it comes to nuclear weapons, and the idea that North Korea could be the instrument of nuclear deterrence against the West. That crazy guy, you never know what that guy in Pyongyang will do, but you can be sure if he does it, that he's doing it in a way that the Russians and or the Chinese are finding strategically convenient. There are, at this moment, I think, not definitive evidence as to the depth of it, but there certainly is Chinese support for North Korea's arming of providing weapons and missiles and artillery ammunition to Russia, and potentially backfilling certain kinds of materials and supplies, or at least industrial capability. So, and Iran also plays a role that's very helpful for, certainly not a Russian satellite. In fact, in terms of the relationship, Iran has definitely strengthened its hand as a producer and supplier of weaponry to Russia, ballistic missiles and drones. But I think also I would not be surprised if Russia did not have at least a supporting role in some of the things happening in the Middle East. Thinking, for example, in October 7th, the ability of Hamas to evade warnings and indications from Israel. There were some warnings, there were some things that people are looking, backwards at, but there was no big trigger. And to understand how the Israelis were looking and what they were looking at in terms of warnings and indications for possible attack, that's a fairly sophisticated question that there may have been outside support on. And certainly, most recently, the sort of overt speculation about providing anti-shipping missiles to the Houthis shows that there's an interest, at least Russia has an interest, probably with acquiescence by China and Iran, for this sort of wider war, for stressing the system. Mohammed, as you pointed out, the West is not capable of dealing with multiple theaters. And so I think there is a commonality of interest among these countries in spreading the theaters in which we have conflict, not as some kind of a coordinated master plan, but just the idea that for Iran, for example, that with the West so focused in Ukraine, that it's a good time to try to make a move in Israel. I think there is Gaza. I think there is, though, a sense among some of these countries, and particularly Russia, perhaps China, that there's a window of opportunity right now to take advantage of, that the disorder of the West, the retreat of America, really steadily going back into our failure to get our heads around what was happening in the Middle East and in Syria in 2011 and 2012, the vacuum then that Russia was able to fill, our ability to create a vacuum, our difficulty thinking through the strategic problems, the complexities, and this instinct of, well, we're just going to go home then, right? This is all too tough. We're going to go home. I think that is not a final answer. And if I were going to say, if we're looking for something in the West, there's a big vacuum for leadership. In some sense, the Trump phenomena has to do with that. People are looking for a leader. I don't think personally that it's the right answer. There definitely is this sense that we need stronger leadership and clearer leadership, and that's going to be I remember as a young researcher and student going, and there's a time when you had Thatcher and Kohl and Mitterrand, and Reagan. Whatever you think of them individually, that was certainly a different class of leadership than the West has today. So, will the stress of the Ukraine war and Russia's and China's assertiveness recreate a class of leaders? That's the big question.
Thank you. And if any of you want to add something, it's the right time. If no, I will thank you all for your amazing points and very interesting views that sometimes were on the same line, sometimes diverted. And it was really interesting for me as a host actually to listen to all of you and to have this discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you, Denise.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
So I look forward to seeing you all again.
Yes.